Good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Clint Vince and I chair Denton's energy practice and co-chair our global energy sector with my teammate Emma Hand, and we both co-chair Denton's Smart Cities and Connected Communities think tank. And we are dealing with the vital topic of the energy crisis, which has grabbed the world by the lapels recently and is shaking. There's a huge amount going on, so no better time to be addressing this important topic. We're really honored to present today's webinar jointly with the Keystone Policy Center and their Key Conversations program. And so we will start with a welcome from the amazing CEO of Keystone, Christine Scanlon, and then we'll hear from Paula Gold-Williams, the chair of the board of Keystone. So Christine, you're up.
Thank you, Clint, and thank you everyone for being with us this morning. This group in particular is like family. Certainly the Keystone family with long connections to our work and the Energy Board, which Paula, Clint, Phil, Rudy, Richard, we're going to have to get you there. So all of you have been such terrific trustees and board members for the Keystone Policy Center. And so I just want to extend my thanks to Denton's. These key conversations have been terrific on timely issues of our moment, and really important conversations with some of the best minds in the energy world in particular. So just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you, Christine.
Okay, I am honored to chair the Keystone Board. I really believe that what's most important for our industry is the ability to have collaboration, relationships, and conversations. And I want to say my deepest thanks out to Denton's and Clint, because you've been a great partner for Keystone in helping us have these conversations. And for all of our colleagues here on the screen that I've had the pleasure of knowing and working with and talking to about what's really important, how we can move the industry along, how we can really evolve and really look at all of the difficult, complex issues that are in front of us to make this transition. I couldn't think of better people to join in today and support. And I do want to end my short remarks, though, extend a great congratulations to Rudy Garza, who is participating today. You will hear from him. He is my successor from CPS Energy, and he was recently named the permanent CEO of CPS Energy. I am more than proud of him. He has leaped into this role. He has been for years a devoted professional, an engineer, a leader, someone who focuses on relationships and conversations, as well as really improving the operations of what CPS Energy has done over the years. So I'm looking forward to the conversation like everyone else. I hope everyone has come with questions and interest, and I think we're going to have lots of fun today.
Thanks so much, Paula and Christine. And now we're really going to launch into it. And to start us off, really one of the, in my opinion, one of the real big minds in energy today. I see every time I open a newspaper or turn on the screen, Richard Newell is having an impact in some vital way. And he's the CEO of Resources for the Future. He is, and I think I have the honor of serving on Richard's President's Council. I think RFF is really putting out some of the best economic and policy analysis in the industry today. It's not simply my opinion. They are frequently named as the top environmental and energy and natural resources think tank in the world. Richard had a number of very important jobs before arriving at this one. And he has served as the administrator of the U.S. Information Administration. He has been a senior economist for the President's Council of Economic Advisors, with particular emphasis on energy and the environment. He is a senior advisor to numerous other important organizations. He is an adjunct professor at Duke University. And I could go on for quite a while about Richard and each of our other panelists, but I'm going to keep these introductions short so that you can hear what's going on in the world and in the United States with respect to the energy crisis. So Richard, with that, I'm going to let you get underway.
Well, it's really a pleasure to be here, Clint, and thank you so much for those kind words, both for me and for RFF. Coming from you, it means a lot. This panel is aptly named the Energy Crisis of 2022, since there's very wide acknowledgement that the world is in fact in the middle of an energy crisis. Maybe the largest energy crisis the world has really ever faced. So in the time I'd like to cover four things. First, where are we in terms of the historical context and how did we get here? Second, how are countries around the world reacting to the crisis and to high energy prices? Third, what are the implications of the energy crisis for climate action and international trade? And finally, I'll close with some brief reflections on good principles for risk management in the energy and climate realm. Well, that's a lot that I just said, so I'll try and keep the pace up. So where are we and how did we get here? Let me start with oil prices, which is one of the most closely watched metrics. There's various benchmarks for the price of oil, but they all move together. And the key global benchmark is the price of Brent crude. So back in 2020, the price of Brent had fallen to an average of $42 per barrel due to the economic contraction associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. And then it rebounded as the economy rebounded to an average of $71 per barrel last year as the global economy recovered. So $71 per barrel average last year was exactly the same average price as back in 2018 before COVID. So as the economy recovered, as the recovery continued, and the United States starting revealing Russia's aggression toward Ukraine, the oil price continued creeping upward toward the beginning of this year. And since Russia invaded Ukraine in February, it has averaged above $100 per barrel and over $120 per barrel in June. The last time oil was this high was in the 2011 to 2014 period, when it averaged above $100 per barrel as well. Now, oil prices have come back down since then over the last month or so, and they're now hovering around $90 to $95 per barrel. Now, recall that Russia is one of the world's top 3 oil producers. That's along with the United States and Saudi Arabia. And so there's been a serious concern about Russian oil exports as the world has applied financial sanctions to Russia. Customers have wanted to stop purchasing Russian oil, and Western oil and gas companies have exited their operations in Russia. So that's the oil situation. What about natural gas? Another key issue here. The EU, the European Union, is particularly dependent on Russian gas, which was flowing to Europe at a rate of about 400 million cubic meters in 2021 before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, at that point, it was supplying 45% of EU gas imports and 40% of the EU's total gas consumption. By June of this year, just a few months ago, that flow had dropped to less than 100 million cubic meters a day, or less than 10% of EU imports, with a particularly steep drop after February of this year. So this squeeze in supply has had a dramatic effect on energy prices. Natural gas prices in Europe last month were more than 10 times their average for this time of year, or around $70 per million BTU. Rather than a more typical $7 per million BTU. Electricity prices in Europe and in the UK are typically set by natural gas plants. So with the cost of natural gas spiking, electricity prices have also skyrocketed. For example, wholesale electricity prices in the UK have jumped to over £500 per megawatt hour in late August, and that's more than 5 times last year's price. Here in the United States, the price of gasoline is the metric by which most Americans judge the energy crisis. The national average gasoline price leapt to over $5 per gallon in mid-June. Now, since then, it's been steadily easing, is now standing around $3.70 per gallon. US natural gas prices have also ramped up significantly, especially compared to the rock bottom prices of 2020. But US natural gas prices, because we have so much domestic production, they remain well below those in Europe, even though they're quite elevated in the United States relative to our experience. So ultimately, this energy crisis has left no country untouched, and countries around the globe are responding in a variety of ways, depending upon their unique circumstances. So that's a bit of context now. How have countries responded? One of the earliest types of interventions focused on increasing supply, including through releases from various countries' strategic petroleum reserves. On March 31st, the Biden administration announced the country's largest SPR release ever at 1 million barrels per day starting in May for 6 months. So that's a total of 180 million barrels in total. There have now been a series of US SPR releases over the past year. For the March announcement, the US release was also coordinated as part of a joint action with other member countries of the International Energy Agency, or IEA, who also released an additional 60 million barrels of reserves. So that coordinated action represented only the 4th collective release in the IEA's history, and by far the largest. Now, the SPR releases are really best suited to ameliorate short-term market dislocations, and it would be futile to try to make up substantial volumes in this fashion over the long run. A number of countries have also seen increases in domestic production of fossil fuels, oil and gas, or fossil fuel-related infrastructure. This includes players as diverse as the United States, Qatar, Japan, Norway, Australia, Algeria, and the UK. This includes oil and gas extraction, and it also includes the construction of pipelines and liquefied natural gas, or LNG facilities. Even as there's been interest in increasing oil and gas supply, there's also been an interest, particularly in Europe, in reducing demand. While market prices are typically relied upon as the principal tool for rationing scarce supply, there's significant distributional and, in turn, political implications of relying solely on market mechanisms. Energy demand is inelastic, meaning that price increases call only a small drop in demand. So inducing short-term demand reductions can require very steep price increases. This explains the EU interest in mechanisms that use shared reduction targets, such as each member country reducing its gas demand by 15% this coming winter, which is on the road toward eliminating Russian gas imports within 5 years. So we'll have to see what each of the individual member countries does to achieve those reduction targets. Countries have also implemented much more direct interventions into markets for oil, natural gas, and electricity. As an example, on September 8th, just that last week, the new UK Prime Minister Liz Truss announced a sweeping set of price caps on natural gas and electricity rates, which were designed to buffet anticipated price increases and accompany inflation. She announced these significant measures only 3 days into her new tenure, which highlights the importance of the issue. The price tag, this is just for the UK, is on the order of £100 billion annually for the next couple of years, and would be one of the most significant recent economic interventions in the UK economy, even larger than the country's COVID emergency response measures. So just to put this in context about how big a deal this is, very big deal. The very next day, last Friday, a number of European energy ministers met to discuss a range of proposed interventions, including capping revenue earned by nuclear, renewable, and other non-gas producers of electricity, and redistributing that money to businesses and consumers. The G7 countries have also been discussing a potential price cap on Russian oil, and the European Commission has floated the idea of a price cap on natural gas coming from Russia, but the support for at least the Russian gas price cap seems to be waning. In general, many of these interventions mark a reversal of many years of liberalized energy policy in Europe, which shows the seriousness of the challenges faced there. Leaders are torn between the political and, more importantly, the human imperative to ensure that power, heating, and cooling are available to the citizens. And at the same time, these are countries that have traditionally been the most committed to action on climate change. So how are these imperatives around these two crises, the energy crisis and the climate crisis, aligning at this very challenging time. So that brings me to another type of intervention seen in recent months, which is deepened investment in advancing low carbon technologies to accelerate the move away from fossil fuels. Funding for clean energy technology, research, development, demonstration, and deployment. So this is sometimes called RD&D. It's taken center stage here in the United States in a number of newly enacted pieces of legislation passed both before and after the energy crisis took hold. That includes the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA. A key feature of the IRA is its use of carrots rather than sticks to move the needle on reducing emissions. So instead of a carbon tax, a fee on emissions, or regulations, the IRA leans heavily on tax credits, direct funding, and other incentives that reward clean technology investment. So the result of this is a bill focused on policies that won't raise energy prices and will in fact probably reduce them by directly supporting the deployment of clean power supply, thus the name Inflation Reduction Act, which may have been surprising to many of us. So I'd like to turn now to focus more fully on the impact of the energy crisis in two key areas beyond the price impacts we've already talked about. The first is international trade, and the second is action to address climate change. The energy crisis has certainly resurrected a focus on energy security as a national imperative, really to an extent we haven't seen since the 1970s and perhaps ever. In terms of international trade in fuels, new deals for LNG have been struck to lessen Russia's hold on Europe's gas supply, and as countries hurry to replenish their stockpiles before winter. But this emphasis on energy security extends beyond just fuels as countries seek to shore up their supply chains in a number of areas, including critical minerals. So critical minerals, as most people are now aware, are really essential components in many of today's rapidly growing clean energy technologies. That's from wind turbines to solar panels to electric vehicles. The list of critical minerals includes copper, lithium, cobalt, nickel, and a variety of rare earth elements. And each of these faces a different set of challenges to a stable supply, both globally and increasingly important at a national level. Cobalt, for example, relies heavily on the Democratic Republic of Congo for production and China for refining. So both of those are each about 70% of the total. And this leads to a concentration of supply with trading partners that are no longer viewed as reliable. Even more mundane commodities like copper are an issue, with copper being an essential component of most electrical devices. Copper is more widely produced, but the world's current copper mines are waning in ore quality and overall reserves, and thereby increasing production costs and environmental impacts. In terms of response, both the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act here in the United States reflect a push by the federal government to diversify sources and increase domestic production. The CHIPS Act provides federal aid to encourage the construction of microprocessor manufacturing facilities in the United States, which strengthens the domestic semiconductor industry. And a lesser known provision of the CHIPS Act establishes a program within the Department of Energy that aims to reduce carbon emissions associated with the production in the United States of low carbon iron, steel, and steel mill products. In addition to the bipartisan legislation passed by Congress, President Biden has also issued executive orders to strengthen the domestic supply chain, accelerate US production of clean energy technologies, and also boost mineral development. For example, an executive order in April directed the Defense Department to consider at least 5 metals, lithium, cobalt, graphite, nickel, and manganese, as being essential to national security under the Defense Production Act. The Pentagon is now authorized to use specific funds to support a wide range of mining and processing activities for metals which are used in EV batteries. There's also a separate executive order that authorizes the Department of Energy to expand support for critical minerals. And DOE recently announced a new $675 million R&D effort on critical minerals. So this increased attention to domestic production of the key components of a clean energy transition, from critical minerals to batteries and many other types of equipment, it's also quite evident throughout the Inflation Reduction Act, and maybe Phil will dig into that a little bit more in his remarks. So there will undoubtedly be ripple effects of this recalibration of international supply chains across the entire US and global economy. Now, let's turn more fully to the implication of the energy crisis for the clean energy transition in terms of climate action. And here there's competing evidence about how this current crisis is affecting countries' climate commitments. many countries, including those in the European Union, are really walking a tightrope between short-term measures to replace supplies and ease prices and long-term ambitious decarbonization agendas. Concerns about policies that might add to energy prices, like the EU emission trading system or ETS, have led to some calls among some EU stakeholders to cap EU ETS prices, to slow down ETS price increases in the future and slow down policies like carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and to continue to allocate free allowances to industry. This is perhaps not surprising, as the EU ETS got close to $100 per ton recently, although it's back down to about 70 euros per ton. In addition, some European countries, including Germany, the UK, and Italy, are considering moving back their previously defined coal phase-out dates. A number of countries in Europe and elsewhere, as we know, are also working to fast-track permitting and construction of new LNG facilities and other natural gas import infrastructure to replace Russian pipeline gas. But I think these are understandable short-term measures, and at the same time that those are being taken, the European countries are also continuing to ramp up renewable energy supply, green hydrogen production, efficiency improvements, and the electrification of many sectors. So I think it's fair to say that while the energy crisis has tested Europe's commitment to decarbonization, the member countries ultimately have sought to accelerate actions consistent with the imperative to reduce emissions. And this is from a starting point where the EU already had a quite ambitious set of policies. Here in the United States, the reaction has been more mixed, and it was unclear until recently whether the energy crisis would stall or accelerate the energy transition in the United States. One of the Biden administration's early moves in response to the crisis was to reinstate oil and gas leasing on federal lands. And this was a move that angered climate advocates, as it was perceived as a sign of waning commitment to climate policy. Of course, natural market forces have also led to an increase in US oil and gas production, maintaining the United States as the world's largest oil and gas producer, and as of this year, its largest LNG export, a fact that's sometimes forgotten. But whatever the short-term measures the Biden administration took, the continued focus and ultimate success in passing the Inflation Reduction Act has clearly accelerated the clean energy transition in the United States. The federal government's providing a wave of financial support and momentum that other policies at the federal, state, and local levels will be able to ride upon. It can now credibly say that it has policies in place to reduce by 40% US emissions by 2030, which is a big step toward the US's commitment of a 50% reduction under the Paris Agreement. So from an international perspective, the United States now enters into climate conversations with an ability to lead, which is a substantial change from where it was just 1 month ago. What about China? Recall that as of a couple years ago in 2020, China's official climate goal, which is still its official goal, was peak coal by 2025, peak emissions by 2030, and net zero by 2060. And while China was originally quite sanguine about its ability to weather the energy crisis, at least in public statements, we've had high coal prices associated with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and there's been some local conditions, a punishing summer heat wave, a lack of rainfall, which have really combined to seriously stress China's electricity supply, particularly in regions that are dependent on hydropower. So if you look at various statements by Chinese government officials and in Chinese government documents, the rhetoric has shifted in a way that seems to place energy security as a more urgent national mission than the green energy transition. This is also illustrated by the fact that provincial coal-fired power plant approvals rose by almost 50% in the first half of 2022 compared to the same time period in 2021. So it seems that for the moment, China is building more of everything from coal power to renewables and electric vehicles. So let me close with some brief reflections on principles we can use to act and react in a time of crisis with multiple goals and also rapidly changing circumstances. It might go without saying, but it's worth reemphasizing that we cannot lose sight of the longer-term imperative to combat climate change, even as there's a human imperative to address the current energy crisis and high energy prices. So to that end, how should we think about energy security in a world where we also need to ensure the resilience of our climate? It seems to me that a reasonable goal is an energy system that is resilient in the face of disruptive events. It's an energy system that can withstand or recover quickly from difficult conditions. At the same time, it means not having your foreign policy overly influenced by energy concerns. So improving energy security is therefore ultimately about risk management. And thinking about it that way clarifies how energy security intersects with climate change, which is itself also fundamentally a risk management problem. So what's the best way to manage risk? The best way to manage risk is multifaceted. It's first by reducing your exposure to the risk, it's by diversifying, and it's by buying insurance. So when we apply these principles to energy security, we can see that in many cases, the steps what we would want to take to increase our energy security make addressing the climate crisis easier and vice versa. Reducing our risk exposure implies increasing energy efficiency and lowering our energy consumption, particularly our consumption of fossil fuels. Enhancing our energy security and reducing climate risk also means having options and flexibility and diversifying. Ideally, it means a variety of different clean energy technologies and fuel options for meeting an energy need, be it transport, buildings, or industry. Options provide a ready substitute. They provide an extra cushion in the event of a disruption of alternatives, as well as a good source of competition. Taking advantage of options in turn requires a robust network, connecting energy sources to energy needs, whether that's a reliable and responsive electricity distribution system, waterways, or a means of alternative fuel distribution like hydrogen. It also means having a variety of different supplier options, both domestic and foreign. Finally, energy security means having some insurance, which can take the form of reserve margins in electricity, strategic reserves for petroleum, and ample natural gas storage. And in the context of climate change, it again means having options that pay off in the worst scenarios that may arise. So in closing, both the climate crisis and energy crisis remind us that we live in a deeply interconnected world, both economically and physically. While serious discussion and tangible action of these dual global needs often occurs in silos, a holistic set of solutions really, I think, can benefit both. So thank you so much, Clint, and all of you for the opportunity to participate today.
Thank you, Richard. That's such an extraordinary explanation of a very complex topic in about 20 minutes. It was really one of the most succinct and impactful presentations I've heard in quite a while. We have, I should have mentioned at the very start, we do invite you all to ask questions. You can do that in the Q&A feature of the Zoom platform. Please don't do it in the chat section. Just use the Q&A section, or I will get dizzy trying to bounce back and forth among the different areas. We do have a question that actually Richard anticipated in his discussion, but you might want to go in a little more depth. Richard, really good question from Dr. Paul Sullivan. How much of the weakening of the focus on energy transitions and climate change do you think are due to the Russian war on Ukraine and its effects? Hypothetical, let's say the war is over before the depths of winter. Russia loses, Ukraine has an unmitigated win. What happens next in oil, gas, and coal trade and the energy transition?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that particularly if you put yourself in the context of the European Union, there's been an extremely tough lesson that's been learned in a very hard way. And so I think that this will have a lasting impact. I don't think we're going to be going back to significant increases in natural gas imports I don't think this will be reversed. So in that sense, I think that the longer term consequence, particularly for the EU, is really an acceleration of the energy transition, a diversification of their supply sources in the meantime, a lot of which has to do with natural gas. So I think that there's a lasting impact there. I think the other impact is it's not just directly related to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it's more generally the increased sense that reliance on global supply chains and kind of the free market of global trade, that there's serious reconsideration of that going on. And I think that critical minerals is an example of that. But there's other examples, just the degree to which carbon is embedded in trade, international trade is intense. There's a lot of evolving conversation about not just the end product and getting the end product at the lowest cost, but what's in it? How is it made? With increased attention to that, the nexus of that and national security. So I think we'll continue to see ripple effects on the kind of trade environment and trade national security nexus that will be I would say probably a multi-decadal thing. The global trade system was set up, let's say, kind of from the 1950s to roughly the present or the last few years. And a whole set of things happened over that period, decades, that I think there's some reconsideration going on. So I don't think that's going to land in autarkic countries in the end, but it'll land somewhere different than where it is right now. I could go on, but so I think there's lasting impacts of this, and not just purely for the energy sector.
Richard, we have just a minute or two before we move into our fireside chat portion of this discussion. You outlined in a beautiful way the timing issues here. I mean, there's been no transition. We've just had this jagged shift from what we thought was energy globalization to energy warfare and geopolitics and energy security on steroids. What is your forecast for Europe, even if they do? I know our European region has been keeping us informed of our law firm, has been keeping us informed of the really dramatic emergency measures that are likely to be passed by the EU this week, I guess, or next. How grim is the situation? I know we're all praying for a mild winter for Europe, but there is so much to be done and so little time.
It's an extremely, I would say it's an extremely difficult situation. And, when you've got, if you remember those statistics I gave earlier, 40% of your natural gas consumption coming from Russia. It's not, 10% would be an issue that you would need to confront. 40% is huge. So, I think the good news is that, the European Union, is obviously taking this very seriously. There's nothing like a murderous war happening on your doorstep to motivate action. So the things that one might have thought would be like implausible or impossible are clearly just have to be done. There is though a gap between the alternative supply sources that the European Union has identified and is continuing to identify and normal consumption needs. And that's where the need for this kind of more emergency-oriented measures on natural gas consumption are going to kick in. So I think that the key issue to watch is, in terms of how things will unfold this winter, is if there aren't natural reasons for consumption to be moderated, it makes it more likely that these extra market, rationing mechanisms will have to take place. And knowing that might happen is why we're seeing these other interventions in the marketplace, because once you have, if you're not using the price mechanism to constrain demand, you've got to do it in some other way, right? And then it becomes a matter of like, how do you allocate that consumption? If it's not being allocated by prices, it's being allocated in some other way. So that's where it really gets complicated, and where we're seeing different actions by different countries. And I think they even, I'm guessing they don't even fully know exactly how that will be done. And probably they shouldn't predefine it, honestly. You're going to have to be nimble depending upon what the exact circumstances are when it comes. So I don't know if that's helpful, Clint, but it is definitely a difficult situation, but they're pretty focused on it.
Very helpful. I think your point about the intensity of feeling in Europe with the war, the invasion, and the raw brutality of it on the doorstep of Europe has been a surprisingly unifying feature. It got brought home to us in our firm. Our office in Warsaw basically got into cars and drove to Ukraine to pick up the members of our office in Kyiv and bring them back into their homes, when it looked initially as though Kyiv would be overtaken. And the feelings are so strong now that that Europe can't buckle. Same thing from our colleagues in our offices in Germany. They are, they didn't anticipate such a dramatic change in policy, but when you're even reconsidering reactivating the two remaining nuclear projects, even though they have been far along on being deactivated, that's an extraordinary policy reversal, I think, that sustains some of the comments you've made. So thank you, Richard. What a great job. And we're going to shift now to our three amazing fireside chat panelists, and all favorites. As Christine said, this is kind of family for us today. And our first is Phil Sharp, former member of Congress, served the 10th Congressional District for 10 terms. He chaired the Energy and Power Subcommittee, had passed major legislation, including one of the key architects of the Energy Policy Act. Phil then went on to serve as the director of the Institute of Politics at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He was Richard's predecessor as president of Resources for the Future. Before that, a very little known fact that I thought I would mention today is that Phil defeated former Vice President Mike Pence twice, in 1988 and 1990, in defending his congressional seat. And I had the distinct honor of co-chairing the Keystone Energy Board with Phil for a number of years. And he is someone that I have respected for decades. And as with Richard, when they speak, I tend to learn a great deal. Phil really is one of the great wise men in energy right now. And so, Phil, we're going to let you get started. And really, if you could frame the US energy policy reaction to the energy crisis, how are we doing?
Well, Clint, thank you so much for that excessive introduction. Some of my liberal friends certainly want to put on my tombstone that I beat the vice president. Some of them want it sooner than later. But I also want to say that you were so right about your comments about Richard's presentation, which has a depth and breadth that are amazing, especially for the time constraint he was operating in. And I'm just delighted. And he's really taken RFF to new heights in its engagement and its involvement in public policy. But let me see if I can add to a few things. I'm going to fly this plane at a little higher level. And Richard covered so many good things. I'm going to just focus on a couple of things. First, just remember, and he was clearly indicating this, there are really two crises going on at the same time. One is the immediate one that has to do with the disruption of oil, gas markets, and electricity markets worldwide, as he outlined very, very strongly. And the other is the decarbonization imperative going on here and around the globe in hopes of warding off the worst effects of global warming. And the two are clearly interlinked, as he brought to bear, both to the stress of a lot of critics who want to go faster on decarbonization, who don't like the responses that have had to be made to the current market. But let me step back just a little farther from that about the context in which I think our broader politics and decisions beyond energy are a thing, because I think it's safe to say, at least from all my friends and the way they talk, is we have just been going through some absolutely unexpected, exceptional events, whether it's COVID, whether it's Putin's war, whether it's the big lie in American elections, whether it's the rise of authoritarianism, whether it's overturning the Roe v. Wade, whether it's inflation. By and large, these were not expected. Certainly, they were not commonly expected. And by and large, they're having a major impact shaking up thinking, shaking up political coalitions, shaking up even government policy. And I think it's very important to recognize partly what this means is we have to engage, as Richard really laid out here in an academic way, more risk analysis of what can we count on, what can we, where should we aim, and in a variety of ways in ahead. But I also this reinforces the real importance of Richard's shop and other research shops on trying to figure things out as they are now and will be on Keystone, trying to bring people together to discuss different points of view to figure out where we're going, the kinds of things you at Denton's are doing in these kind of programs and kind of things. It's the recognition we have a massive collective challenge to figure out what's the wisest thing to do. And there aren't, many people have magic solutions, but in my view, there are almost none. Now, the key question here, I think for the United States is, are we capable of responding, given our fractious politics, given our bitter partisan divide at the moment, are we capable of responding effectively to many of these shocks? And given the importance of fossil fuels to our current way of living in this country, all across the board in our society, can we develop, or do we have the politics that can sustain the policies to get us to decarbonization? I don't have the answers to these questions, but they are extremely important ones we're facing. In the broader context too, we see both abroad and even here in America, what's often referred to as the rise of authoritarianism. It is the challenge to democracy that, of course, Putin represents it, Xi represents it, but there are forces here in America, and part of the challenge is not just the way you use power, but it is the assumption that democracies are incapable of staying united enough, able to keep order, able to deal with these different shocks. And therefore, if they can't, you should turn to authoritarian systems. And this is an undertow that is very significant in our country. And of course, in the 1930s was an overwhelming, led to overwhelming change in Europe and frankly, for us in World War II. Now, let me suggest to you, I'm going to, this is a consumer warning. I take a more positive view than almost all of my friends in our capacity in this country, and I hope elsewhere, to really deal with these things. And I think that, in fact, it's often surprising to hand-wringing commentators that see only deep problems. Richard has already responded to how Europe and the United States is responding to the current crises. This isn't over, and this winter is going to be a massive test, especially in Europe, for the ability to sustain policy and to manage the disruptive market. But I'd like to turn to that broader question of, can we, the drive for decarbonization in the United States, and say a few things about that. Richard laid out the really important thing, and I'm not sure Americans understand this, but we have had an unbelievable, productive US Congress. Mostly of us think of it as constipated and divided. And in fact, not just this term, but it actually began even under Trump, believe it or not, some very significant things. He alluded to the 2020 Energy Act, the Infrastructure Act, which is, of course, under the newer Congress, the CHIPS and Science Bill, and, of course, the massive climate provisions in the Inflation Reduction or the Reconciliation Act. And let me just make a few points that partly ones he made, but I just want to reemphasize them about the nature of what these policy decisions add up to and how, in some ways, they are different from the era that I was involved in and others on the panel, and you've been involved in forever, in terms of the federal government. One, I just think the general conclusion, which he alluded to, that this is, these proposals, the combination, should strongly advance decarbonization in our economy. Now, how effective they remain, how effective they will be remains to be seen, which, by the way, is all the more important to have RFF and other organizations judging how policy is doing along the way. because we can't just say, oh, well, we've got it now. And the computer models say we'll get X and we got it. That's just beyond comprehension altogether. But also let me suggest that, that as he did, that the policy tools that were adopted heavily are weighted, obviously, to tax and grants incentives from the government. In other words, pouring out federal money into the private sector for having public capital try to enhance and attract private capital to make this change. And that is quite different than the previous approaches that were argued about, whether it's a carbon pricing regime, which might be tax or it might be cap and trade, which actually in one case would raise capital for the government and it would press the private sector to bear the burdens of that. This is a shift that is really quite significant in the public funding. Also, I would suggest we do not want to forget that it's at the same time, it as well as existing law has allowed for, and we're seeing it advance, some major regulatory activities. One we already had on the auto fleets in this country, but now that's been extended to the heavy duty trucks, heavy duty things too. We see also that we're going to be, there's a real drive to regulate what we call fugitive emissions or methane leakage. That's natural gas, obviously, whether it's in the production end or the pipelines or the distributing place. And this is viewed as a very significant possibility to curb some of the very, these are high heat, they can hold heat much more than a molecule of carbon dioxide. And of course, the administration helped lead at the Glasgow International Conference a worldwide commitment to trying to curb this. And one that's not often remembered is that we're going to be strengthening our regulations on Hfcs. Those are the refrigerants. Again, a high intensity thing. It's not a large quantity, but it's very intense greenhouse gas. And this means we're going to live up to the Kigali amendment to the Montreal Protocol, one of the most successful international treaties, which, by the way, was undertaken by a Republican administration, the Reagan administration. Another thing to recognize in this is not only have we adopted this plethora of various tax credits and incentives, but they are actually in the law for at least 10 years. And this represents an effort to get past our past history where we were on again, off again, which jerked the industry and the investments around. Another thing that I think should be recognized here about policymaking is this also represents, even on a bipartisan basis, a remarkable shift in the idea about industrial policy. This has been debated for many years as to how much the government should get into the role of supporting a given industry here at home to compete abroad, for example. And here what we have, whether it's the CHIPS bill or some of these other, is that we really are going to support some very explicit, as Richard said, manufacturing along the lines of transistors. We're also really making the choice of technology in the transportation sector, something we've always argued we were trying to avoid, having the government choose which was the thing. But now we're into electric vehicles. There are various variations on that technology, but still it is a major direction the government is taking on this. And of course, we have the EV, all the effort to get electric vehicles in place. Another feature of these proposals is the use of what's called direct pay. The direct pay to try to make essentially it's to try to make the tax credits work for non-taxed entities, so that what this has the effect of doing is, in particular, it's aimed at rural electric cooperatives, municipal electric systems, public power, where there'll be a direct grants on the basis of actions they take to adopt technologies, kind of thing. And this is about a third of the electric power in the country. And in the past, there was always a huge struggle as what to do about these entities, especially the rural electrics, turning many of them into resistors to public policy. And this really makes a major shift in that. Also, and obviously, one of the things the administration speaks a lot about, and it's real, and we'll see how well it works out, is the trying to focus many of these incentives on dealing with social problems, trying to make sure that we are more equitable, meaning that we address, for example, they have what we call bonus tax credits or bonus or elevated tax credits. An industry gets more of a credit if they will locate in one of these specific areas where we would have a lot of coal production, or if they will adopt certain labor standards, or if they will address certain inequitable issues, kind of thing. So this is an effort to tie in. Now, this is a real developing and difficult policy area for the government to deal with on energy policy, but it's significantly expanded the political support and the people that have an invested stake who previously were quite suspicious of any of these actions that would only penalize them further, kind of thing. And finally, let me just mention a couple spillover effects beyond the direct market thing here in the United States. Obviously, this really helps support stronger, more aggressive state government actions, because essentially what you have is the federal government subsidizing the things that might be regulated and by an industry that will help subsidize them to take action. Essentially, this happened years ago, for example, in Iowa, when the PTC was adopted at the federal level, and the state was trying to actively get windmills in place, and they did. But it was a twofer. It was these things work together. Now, we've already seen the state of California. They were about to do this independent of the reconciliation bill, and the state of Massachusetts adopt major new aggressive targets and policies, especially with respect to the electric vehicles kind of thing. But this will help finance state policy actions that we can expect to see more. And then let me also add very clearly, I think Richard alluded to this, this certainly enhances our credibility in international global climate negotiations. It can no longer be said that we're the laggards in the world. And I think it also hopefully helps in the world markets to make some of these technologies more competitive, which may in some instances actually help in the developing world, which faces a major struggle with all this. So let me wrap up the answer to this question a little more quickly and just say, I don't think there's any question that we have now major policy adopted at the federal government level. That doesn't mean it's necessarily adequate. We're going to have fights about that going forward. And clearly, I didn't use any mathematical statistics. I let Richard and the RFF and others do the modeling that's necessary that will tell us this. But I think the real world effects of these policies, obviously, we'll only know how effective they are over time. But we clearly need, as a result, continuing assessments of these policies and how whether or not they're effective, not just what the outcome is on emissions, but what is working and what is not, because we're going to have to comb through these policies over the decade ahead. Secondly, I think we continue to need the rising pressure that we get across the society, the pressure that people individually and in various organizations are bringing on the government to implement and stick to this. They're on the corporations to cut their footprints. These pressures are not about to disappear, and they should not disappear because we suddenly have adopted a whole lot of policies. Well, I'll stop preaching and see what else you want to talk about.
Well, that was a hefty chunk of wisdom right there. And you really anticipated about 3 or 4 of my questions beautifully, going from not just framing the discussion, but talking about some of the political issues coming forward and the difference between strictly bipartisan legislation and moving into an era where, you know, we have to make sure some of these policies are sustainable, even in reconciliation bills and so on. But we probably have time for one or two more quick questions. One thing that we haven't really covered yet, Phil, that you are a true expert on, you're a member of the Blue Ribbon Nuclear Commission. What do you see as kind of the outlook for nuclear going forward in the United States?
Well, this is one of the $64,000 questions going forward. But I guess I don't think there's any question that we now have more policies in place to try to keep operating unless they're clearly unsafe, the reactors that we have in place. But we now have policies in place that also to try to accelerate advanced designs. And that was in the 2020 Energy Act, which, by the way, was partisan, but it was all part of a massive appropriations kind of thing, in which, and I think it's also in the infrastructure where the government's going to help invest in a couple demonstrations of what we call advanced technology. But also what we see is, as I think Richard was alluding to, in Europe, they already had planned to shut down, as you know, in several countries, their things, but the Germans are trying to make sure they don't shut down the 3 remaining plants. The Belgians are going to keep theirs going. The Japanese are talking about getting more of theirs back online. They only have a few back online from the Fukushima thing, but they're committed to that. The French are the French have not been closing them down, but they've had a bunch of them offline because of just various problems with individual plants, and they're struggling to get those back online. And here in the United States, one of the most remarkable political turnarounds is in California, where they had planned to shut down the last remaining plant, the Diablo Canyon, which provided about 10% of their total electric supply, by the way. And now the state legislature, the governor, and all of them are talking about keeping this open beyond, I think it was 2025. I can't remember the date it was supposed to be totally shut down. And by the way, they're likely to get money from these new federal programs to help them do this. I would also like to suggest that there are, and of course there's lots of private investment going on in something called the SMRs, the small modular nuclear reactor, and the NRC has been trying to prepare how to regulate that because it has to regulate it for safety reasons, of course. But also, this sometimes is not lumped in with nuclear, but it's a different nuclear. It's fusion, which is, instead of splitting atoms, it's pushing them a sig. But the remarkable thing is this has got a revival in the last several years, particularly in the private marketplace. MIT has a spinoff there that is making remarkable progress in what we call the magnets that hold the plasma together for fusion, and several of these are claiming they will have net energy developments within the next few years. So there's no question that it is. Now, look, if things go wrong in this war, and either with Chernobyl, which probably is less of a threat of danger than those 6 reactors at, I'm not sure I pronounced this right, Zaporizhzhia, where there's been fighting over them. Obviously, this could be a significant political damper on developments. But the remarkable thing is that Fukushima, we thought would be a real damper on politics in America for nuclear, but in fact, it had very little impact. And what we find is people in the areas of nuclear power plants tend to be very supportive of them because they see the economic and job and political advantage to it. So anyway, the picture is mixed, but it's very clear that this, because of the compelling issue of climate change, that this goes forward. And people should know that right now, the reactors that are operating in the United States produce half of all what we call clean energy in this country. So we would have a major negative impact and greater hill to climb if we decided to start shutting those down.
Thank you, Phil. And one last really quick question. You won't be able to do it justice in just a couple of minutes, but can you comment really quickly on resiliency, what we're learning about the need for resiliency? And I know Rudy will have comments on this as well, having gone through Winter Storm Uri. But can you give us 2 minutes of 50,000-foot comments?
Well, Rudy will probably do a lot better job, and he has to face it in real time on the ground kind of thing. But I don't think there's any question that if you go back about 10 years, you would have found the environmental movement not willing to talk about what then was called adaptation. But resiliency has now become a political uniter in the country across party lines in a way that is and it's because, of course, in all regions of the country, we are now seeing real world impacts and real costs on whether it's individuals or businesses or governments with the extreme weather events that I think it's safe to say now, science is willing to say, are in part generated by the warming of the earth. And so the point is that's going to be now, from my point of view, just to go to the future a little bit, is when we had the federal government, as we just now did, decide to put a lot of private capital into the marketplace. And I think that's good, we did, but I think it's going to create a situation 10 years from now or before where we need also something like a carbon tax, something to bring money back in as well as keep going forward, frankly, to pay for resilience, frankly, to pay for all the multitude of things that demand public money kind of thing. So this resilience is going to cut multiple ways, but it's increasingly forcing people to think about this issue and to address it.
Perfect response, and you've kept us on track on time.
You kept
Richard and Phil, and thank you. Really, really splendid. We're now going to, as Phil mentioned, we're going to transition really from talking about policy and an extraordinary overview provided by Richard and then Phil at the domestic level. Rudy is going to be our guy that takes us to the operational level, a practical operational level of running a utility system. And both are combined. Rudy is CEO of CPS Energy in San Antonio. As Paula mentioned in such a nice way, he is now the permanent CEO of CPS, and we are thrilled to be one of the first forums to receive Rudy in that well-earned, well-deserved capacity. CPS is the largest municipally owned electric and gas system in the United States. Rudy's got a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering. He has also lots of experience in communications, consumer outreach. He has a master's in business administration, understands the business side of the practice and the communication side, as well as the engineering and operations side of I think real significant importance. Rudy is the first Hispanic leader in the history of CPS. And he is a board member of the Keystone Policy Center. Eventually we will snorkel Richard Newell onto Keystone in some way, but we have him surrounded now by these extraordinary luminaries. And with that, let me begin, Richard. According to the latest US Census data, San Antonio is ranked as the fastest growing city in the country. Can you share some examples of how you're dealing with everything from supply chain to resilience to the practical issues that we've been discussing from a policy standpoint?
First off, thank you, Clint, for the invitation to join you. This actually is my very first, speaking engagement post, post board decision on my presidency here at the utility. And as always, I appreciate you including CPS Energy's perspective. I want to thank my predecessor, my mentor, my friend, Paula Gold Williams, for her leadership and doing what she does so gracefully. She's a great leader and a good person, and she is somebody that has had a tremendous impact on me personally in my career. So Paula, thank you for your leadership, ma'am. Clint, growth is a great thing, can be a great thing in circumstances where you don't have all of the challenges that our industry has been facing now for well over 2.5 years. We've been dealing, as the esteemed speakers before me have mentioned, we've been dealing with the global pandemic, which changed the world. We've been dealing with the coldest of winter storms that we've seen in Texas since the late 1800s in Winter Storm Uri, dealing with one of the hottest summers on record. We're one day shy of the most 100-degree days in a summer in Texas history. This past summer was brutal for our customers and our communities. And we've got supply chain challenges on top of all that have persisted due to disruptions in the global supply chain processes. So while we continue to grow, and certainly the growth, while it hasn't slowed down, we're starting to see symptoms of the squeeze that the supply chain is putting on our processes here in San Antonio and really across the entire industry. All utilities across the country, and I would surmise across the world, are dealing with a lack of transformers, a lack of meters, a lack of conduit for to pull our cable through, a lack of gas meters and gas risers on the gas side of our business. We're having trouble right now getting new trucks for our crews to go out and manage our system. And so when you look at just the extremity of the supply chain challenge reach across our value chain here in San Antonio, it's been pretty significant. I think we have dealt with it, as well as any utility can possibly deal with these supply chain issues. And we've had to get creative. As soon as we saw these issues, materializing, I met directly with our developers in San Antonio and said, hey, we're going to have to not fight over the limited supplies that we have and work together to create a just-in-time process so that maybe instead of full development of 1,000 home subdivision, maybe you take it in 250 lot chunks so that everybody can get the availability of transformers or meters or whatever is slowing us down a bit, and we can keep the economy going. So we've had to get creative in how we communicate with our stakeholders on what is available and how we're going to utilize it in the most effective manner. We've had to change our engineering standards where we've increased suppliers probably exponentially here at CPS Energy, because we've had to look at our standards and say, okay, well, we prefer this one widget to this other widget, but which of these options are meet the safety requirements, and can we go ahead and flex our standards processes to take advantage of whatever material we can get our hands on. We've gone out into the community with customers who are no longer there or active or utilizing load. We'll recover transformers and meters and material that we can repurpose, and we'll recycle them. We'll bring them up to speed for those that are really old, paint transformers to look new and do things that we have to do to recondition them, and then put them right back out into our system. And so when you look at the entirety of the impacts, again, we are still growing, but we have had to be real strategic highly communicative. We've had to partner, with our stakeholders across the community to really just make it work. But I don't see the global supply chain challenges releasing anytime soon. I think we're going to be dealing with this over the next at least couple, 2-3 years. But every week I get a list of material that is constrained in some way, and the amount of materials that are in that red category grow by the week. The red category of materials that are impacting our projects here is getting larger and larger. And again, I come from a coastal community about 2 hours south of San Antonio and Corpus Christi, and what I really worry about, just as a leader in this industry, is what happens if a hurricane hits, the East Coast or Florida or the Texas Gulf Coast, and we need 1,000 transformers, that are all in our sweet spot of transformers that we use on a regular basis. I worry for our country that we don't have a strategic supply of that type of equipment that we can lean on to get our existing customers back in service, much less deal with the growth that we know is coming. So I think this issue, is broader even than we're talking about. We're talking about it with our state officials. I've asked our Public Utility Commission to look at this issue and to maybe include a recommendation to the legislature on a strategic reserve of materials that we need to stay and keep Texas in business. But it's a pretty significant challenge for our industry right now.
Rudy, you've had no easy yardage. You had Winter Storm Uri, which was really revealed a market failure by ERCOT. But of course, although it was a market failure, all of the local utilities across the state of Texas were the first entities that the consumers looked to. How could this happen? You've had extremely hot weather that you've mentioned, record hot weather, and with gas prices really skyrocketing, as Richard pointed out. You've got tremendous price increases. What are some of your strategies to deal with all of these complex issues that have landed on your doorstep, in addition to the supply chain problems that you've just mentioned?
We have, of course, Texas is an island. We're not connected outside of some small, direct, DC ties to the eastern or western grids. And so our problems are our own. There's no leaning on capacity or gas supply or whatever the case might be. Gas supply maybe, that's a national supply there. But when you look at how our grid's configured, we've gotten behind the 8 ball, so to speak, a bit, because we haven't really built base load capacity, large gas plants. Can't build nuclear anymore. It's way too expensive. The coal that we have is being challenged to close down, early because of the implications on climate change. And so when you look at how we're going to meet the capacity needs of a growing economy in Texas going forward, your options become limited, and you have to really start thinking about, how much volatility risk are you going to accept when natural gas prices have hit double digits for the first time since the early 2000s. That's an issue we have to contend with. But when you're looking to achieve reliability, natural gas is probably, you're in the short term, the only other thing you can do besides the nuclear and coal that you already have. In Texas, we've built a lot of peaker units around the state. The industrials have built a lot of cogen facilities along the coast to serve their needs. And San Antonio in particular has done a lot of really good demand response and energy efficiency initiatives to get our customers involved in that strategy. But over the next 2-3 years, our ability to build our way out of the hole that we're in is going to be limited. Right now, CPS Energy is having a conversation about our generation plan. What does our resource plan look like for the next 8-10 years? How are we going to deal with the question on coal and whether or not we're going to continue to be a coal operator or move away from that operation? these are issues that the entire state of Texas is grappling with right now, because again, nobody, because of the uncertainty in how the market reforms are happening in our state, wind, for instance, we built $8 billion worth of transmission lines to get wind out of West Texas, but you still have constraints on the amount of wind you can get out when it's really blowing out there. And so, a Western Connect grid, Western connection to the grid might help alleviate and get that power to some market where operators can benefit, from pricing opportunities. So we got a lot of work to do to deal with the immediate constraints in the state of Texas on how we're going to manage the growth and the capacity needs that we're going to see in the future. And just going back to your statement about natural gas supply, that's been through all of our challenges. That's probably been the most egregious of issues that we've really fought hard on. I mean, the gas industry, they're Goliaths. CPS, little old CPS Energy, on the grand scheme of thing, we're the David, in this conversation. And the $1 billion, the $10 billion that was really transferred from the electric industry and natural gas utility industry over to the gas supplier industry, that could happen again tomorrow. Nothing has been done to alleviate the risk associated with an extreme weather event and gas prices spiking. When I've got to continue pumping gas into my gas system and into my gas plants to be able to maintain reliability, I don't have an option to not take that gas. And I've got to take it regardless of what the market is doing. And the market structure has to reflect that reality that there's consumers on the other side of the utility that's purchasing a commodity to meet that need. That structure in Texas needs to be fixed. And I will continue to beat this drum. Paula started the drum beating, during her tenure. I've continued to stay consistent that this is an issue that should concern policymakers. Leaving consumers vulnerable to a multi-billion-dollar issue when now we've seen the coldest weather in 2021 and the hottest summer in 2022, I think we should expect to see continued extreme weather events that will drive commodity prices the way that they've gone, and we're going to have to be prepared. Our customers can only take so much, Clint, and that's what I'm begging our policymakers to pay some attention to.
It's amazing that in Texas, if during a natural disaster, if a Holiday Inn raises its rates $100 to gouge customers, there'll be an investigation by the Attorney General, State Attorney General. But if a gas supplier raises its price of gas 70,000%, which occurred in Texas, to Rudy's point, there's no regulatory response to that and no legislative response. It's really stunning, and it has impacted not just Texas, but a number of states surrounding Texas were impacted by that result. And it has really infuriated regulators as far away as Minnesota, but they have no authority, of course, in Texas. And because of the intrastate nature of the Texas regulation, FERC is very limited in what it can do as well. So I think you raise a gigantically important policy issue that just has to get addressed as soon as humanly possible. Can you cover two topics in the next 5 or 10 minutes, Rudy? One, you've done sort of following on Paula Go-Williams' lead, you've done tremendous work on both energy efficiency and the development of renewables. Can you talk about that a little bit? And I know that energy efficiency and conservation is going to be near and dear to Paula Glover's heart, as she is our cleanup hitter, and she really has a couple of the best tools the toolbox for dealing with both rising prices and affordability and equity.
Well, Clint, here's what I'd say about our resource mix. And I talked a little bit about the challenges with coal and nuclear as part of an expansion of capacity going forward. So you're going to have to rely on what's available. CPS Energy has always, for the last 10 years, has been hugely aggressive in our pursuit of energy efficiency and demand response resources. We achieved close to a full gigawatt of energy efficiency demand response over our initial 10-year Save for Tomorrow energy plan program. We just recently got our board and city council to approve another 5-year program, 350 megawatt goal, roughly $400 million worth of spend. And you know, our mantra there is, you know, our customers have to be part of the solution. You know, they have to help us manage the peak, because that's one less peaking unit, one less power plant that I have to go and manage for. If I can hit a button and get, you know, 200-300 megawatts of energy efficiency demand response resources, you know, then the cheapest form of energy, you know, is the energy you don't use. And our customers get that. And in Texas, because of the competitive areas outside of public power areas, we're not in competition in Texas, but Dallas, Houston, you know, South Texas, they are in competition. They don't value energy efficiency and demand response the way we do. And so when you look at the resources available in Texas, my conversation with Brad Jones, the interim president and CEO of ERCOT this past summer, you know, when Texas hits their demand response button, they get about 500 megawatts of demand response. Well, 200 megawatts of that is San Antonio. 40% of the entire ERCOT market energy efficiency demand response program comes from, you know, effectively the third largest city, you know, in the state of Texas. And that just tells me that the state's got a huge opportunity to go after additional, you know, resources and come up with programs in the competitive market to kind of mirror what we're trying to do here in San Antonio. That's because we don't have a huge industrial base here, right? So you know, so what we get takes a lot. I mean, it's our school systems, and it's the corporate partners that we do have, and it's our office buildings, and you know, so the investment you make in energy efficiency and demand response, in addition to saving individual customers, you know, 25 to 40% on their annual electric bill, also saves the entire system. And you know, and that's not something that intuitively a lot of people just don't understand that fact. But it's the same as me taking and investing, you know, $600 million in a power plant. It's the exact same thing. You know, it's a power plant I don't have to build, that I don't have to operate, that, you know, that benefits the entire system. So energy efficiency will continue to be a large focus of ours as in terms of overall capacity planning. But then we're going to invest in everything else. You know, since we can't diversify our portfolio in the future on the basis of fuel, we're going to have to diversify our resources on the basis of technology. So we're looking at all forms of energy storage. I think we can do a sizable geothermal plant. We're going to invest in a pilot project to test that technology out, and I'm hoping we can go big on geothermal over the next year. You know, we've invested with a little company called Quidnet, a little startup that's doing hydro pump storage up in the San Saba area in the Texas Hill Country. You know, it's a 1 megawatt little bitty project, but you know, if they can scale up to 15 or 20 megawatts, that's a peaking unit. You know, we're continuing to build solar. I've signed a 300 megawatt deal as part of Paula's Flex Power Bundle initiative over the last couple of years, and we're about to sign an additional 180 megawatts. But we're having trouble getting companies tied down on a price on battery storage because the supply chain issues are impacting that as well, right? So, I mean, right now, even if I wanted to build another gas plant, I got to get in line for a turbine 3 years ahead of the time I'm going to need it, actually. So, you know, so right now we're trying to get our hands on any capacity, however big or small we can possibly find to add to our mix. And if, you know, I've got authorization for 350 megawatts worth of demand response, but I think when we do our resource plan, it's going to suggest that we can do more. and then I'll go have a conversation with our board and our city council about what it's going to take to, what it's going to cost us to do more. But I think we're going to have to really lean on energy efficiency demand response to bridge the next 3 to 5 years it's going to take for the state to get our collective stuff together and go out and start building some power plants again.
Well, Rudy, you and CPS have already been an exemplar on renewables. You're one of the leaders. You are the leader in Texas.
Well, we're #1 in solar in the state of Texas, and we're #2 in wind. So nobody can suggest that CPS Energy hasn't done our part to increase a renewable portfolio across the state. We're, again, may not, I'll probably take more coastal wind because it blows during the day than West Texas wind, but I'll take as much solar as I can get, because at the end of the day, #1, we're getting it at a really competitive price, especially in a high natural gas market, high natural gas price market. Renewables are in the money right now. And so we're trying to get as much solar as we can get our hands on. But again, the supply chain issues have affected our ability to execute to the 900 megawatts we were trying to get. So if I can get to 500 megawatts, we're probably going to have to go back to the drawing board, and kind of restart our procurement process because it's just, our counterparties are having a hard time not giving us a firm price. They'll give us a price range, which means we got to take on a little bit more risk. So so we're trying to figure out how to get a deal actually papered, in a way that is consistent with our risk profile.
Well, you've given us the perfect transition to my other favorite Paula Glover. And we've got my 2 favorite Paulas on the screen today. And I think your discussion of energy efficiency, the demand side issues, I think that is going to have to be a huge part of the solution. And Paula is going to explain that to us. And it addresses not simply supply, the supply problems and the need to reduce the emphasis on supply, but Paula will also explain for us the impact on affordability and equity. But Paula Glover is the CEO of the Alliance to Save Energy, which is really one of the leading energy efficiency conservation organizations in the US. It has a legendary board of directors of advisory board with members of Congress. One of the very few subject issues, coming back to Phil Sharp, one of the very few subjects that actually is bipartisan, and therefore gives us hope that there will be a lot more development. Before taking over at the helm of the Alliance to Save Energy, Paula was the extraordinary president and CEO of the American Association of Blacks in Energy. And she is a board member of the Keystone Policy Center. And I'm also honored to serve on Paula's board. And she is, just as you will discover in a moment, is really an amazingly dynamic leader, has been a leader in the energy industry for close to 25 years. And so, Paula, can you begin by really allowing us to understand why energy efficiency and conservation are 2 of the most important tools in the toolbox right now?
Sure. And so first, thank you, one, for inviting me and for the introduction. And I've been taking furious and copious notes from the 3 other panelists. So I'm hoping that I can contribute something that is useful. But to answer your question, I think I want to start with where Rudy left off. And really, I think his statement about the ability of efficiency to manage capacity and demand, which is a piece of it that we don't necessarily talk about, is really a mic drop, in addition to all the other things that efficiency has the capability of doing. And I might suggest that while it's even more important today because we're in the middle of a crisis, that we should be leaning in and doubling down on efficiency, I would suggest that that's always been the case. and that we have an energy crisis that's going on. We also have an economic crisis that's going on. And we are also now, as Phil noted, attempting to really try to close a lot of the societal social justice issues that we've been dealing with in this country for multitude of generations. And as it relates to efficiency, I think there's an opportunity that we, I think as a tool can answer and really participate in all three of those kinds of issues. So there's one of the ability to manage capacity and demand through demand response. There's also the ability to help consumers save money on their bills just through basic conservation measures, in addition to Energy Star, demand response, moving towards virtual power plants, digitization, all these other new technologies that we have going on, but just the foundational best basics of efficiency. And I mean things like ensuring that everybody has proper insulation in their homes. They don't. Ensuring that all households have good windows and doors. We know that they don't. We continue to invest in weatherization and lie heap. In my opinion, they are Band-Aids for a problem that's much bigger than that. And those Band-Aids only really help the bottom 20% of the people who really need it. So we know that 80% of the people who actually even qualify for those programs are never going to get it. But they're Band-Aids. And so I think efficiency really, if we had the kinds of policies, and I believe the IRA, as well as the infrastructure bill, create opportunities and give us policies that allow us to really lean in and serve customers a lot broader than we have been able to. I think that's the role that efficiency can play in this particular moment. And then I think if we talk about just justice broadly and this idea of energy justice, and so definitionally what we're talking about is ensuring that people benefit, and communities benefit from the energy system economically as well as societally. So it's two things, and that means that we want to make sure that communities have all of the infrastructure that they need to be a high functioning community. Every public school is able to have internet access for their education. Those buildings, operate well, they're clean, they're efficient, they're healthy homes. All of that stuff is part of what we're talking about in terms of energy justice, not just environmental justice, which tends to get all of our attention, but we should be thinking about the other things as well. But there is also the economic piece. And I would suggest that goes beyond jobs. I think we limit ourselves when we only talk about the jobs that the energy system creates and that this transition can create, because we also build businesses, and we should be thinking about what are the businesses that we are building? Where are we building those businesses, And so are small rural communities having the same opportunity for economic growth that urban communities would get? Are Black and Brown communities getting the same opportunities as Native and other communities? And so that economic piece in terms of tied to the energy system, I think is really, really important. And as we're talking about justice, certainly as I talk about energy justice, I'd like to spend a lot of time on the economics because we know the societal benefits. And we understand very clearly, I think, environmental justice and what the health benefits can be. But we don't often talk about the economic benefits. But we all also know that someone's going to make money. Lots of folks are going to build businesses and make money in this transition. And we should be focusing on how do we ensure that all of our communities are in that place. And the beauty of efficiency is that because so much of what we do is local, we have a real big role to play on that side, You're not going to get someone who's going to be installing heat pumps that lives in Oklahoma going to Maine. You shouldn't have to. You should be able to educate, train, et cetera, folks in Maine to install that technology in Maine, as well as those folks who are going to do it in Oklahoma, Hawaii, Alaska, what have you. And because efficiency work is so localized, I think that creates another opportunity for us on the economic side for this transition. I said a mouthful plus.
Well, you covered not just my initial question in a beautiful way, but also my follow-up question, which was going to be on sort of equity and justice. Why is energy efficiency and conservation so underfunded? It makes no sense to me.
I think Rudy touched on it a bit, It's what you don't use, I think it's hard for people, two things, right? Hard for people to understand this idea that we're investing in something that we're not going to use, right? So I'm asking people to make a bigger investment so that they don't use something in the future. That's a hard thing for folks to kind of grapple with. But I would also say for leaders who are in Rudy's position, it's hard for customers and folks to really believe that the utility company, who oftentimes is the person who is the organization entity that's pushing out efficiency programs, that they're the ones who actually want me to save money. It seems a bit counterproductive that the light company would want me to use less electricity, right? And yet across the country, typically it is the light company that is trying to have the programs and is trying to get consumers to be engaged in those programs. And consumers many don't believe that that's really what they're trying to do. They think there's something else that's going on there. There isn't, but we haven't done a great job of really sharing with customers or communities broadly, or even our policymakers, why efficiency is so important for the management of the grid, right? Why is it important to us as a company to get customers to participate, as opposed to why is it only important for customers? Companies get great benefit from customers and participating in these programs. And we need to talk more about that in addition to like what the customer benefit is to the programming. And then I would say, right, because I like to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we have with these programs, which is how do we measure it? And particularly as we think about justice and equity, right? How do we measure these programs in a way that folks would actually adopt them? And so an example I'll use is if we think about and look at what just came out of the IRA and the money that's invested for tax credits for folks to buy EVs. They're point of sale. They're not rebates. And that matters, right? Getting the money off when I buy the car gives you a better shot at me actually buying this vehicle when I know I'm going to get my $7,500 off at the jump, as opposed to I buy the car, I fill out the paperwork, and when I file my taxes, I get a $7,500 credit. Those little kinds of mechanisms make a big deal when we start talking about equity. They just really are. And so we have to think about the policies, I think, and be kind of creative. You know, another example would be we at the Alliance are really excited about the tax credits that were put in the IRA, right? And the opportunity to have higher tax credits for people to adopt more efficient stuff. That's, I think, fantastic. But we also understand that there are a lot of homeowners and others who actually don't itemize their taxes. And so that is an incentive that does not work. If I don't itemize my taxes, your tax credit is not incenting me to put in, say, an electric heat pump. That means now I've got to come up with some other way to incentivize consumers to adopt this kind of technology. And equity, you know, when we look at things through that equity lens, that's how you start to see that there are these different mechanisms or tools that you actually use, right? We would not have thought about folks who did not itemize, except that we were thinking about equity and how do we get a universal adoption of a tool. And that really then got us to, okay, but if I don't itemize my taxes, then what am I supposed to be doing? And so that equity lens, I think, started as a conversation around social justice, but I might suggest that it should be broadened because we have an enormous problem and a multitude of communities around this country who all look very, very different. And as Phil noted, even in his overview, when you start thinking about munis and rural co-ops and IOUs and the communities that those entities serve, they are all very different. The infrastructure sometimes is very different, and certainly the investment in those kinds of infrastructures can be different. And so now, if you're thinking about equity, you got to think about what are all the different solutions that I need to deal with all these different kinds of issues that are going on in communities. I think the good news is we also have technology like digital twins and other things that allow us to kind of do those assessments a lot quicker than we would have been able to do, say, 10 years ago. But you have to, I think that systems thinking of it, I think is really important as we're trying to transition all communities. And we, you know, for me, we ask ourselves, I certainly ask myself, using it through an equity lens is absolutely the right thing to do. I don't know if it's certainly not the easiest thing to do, and certainly not the fastest thing to do, but is that what we need to do to get us there? right? And so if we think about electrifying buildings, for example, and we talk a lot about building codes for new builds and being able to retrofit new buildings and the challenges around maybe retrofitting an older building as we're trying to address climate, the question is, do we have to do all buildings to meet our climate and our decarbonization goals? Is that required? Or are we thinking about all buildings because we understand that through an equity lens and an investment end, we should be thinking about everybody? And so, right, understanding what the goal is that we're trying to address and why we're trying to address that goal, and then how we're measuring that success, I think is going to be important, because there are going to be some competing interests. And decarbonization and electrification sometimes compete against equity. Sometimes electrification is going to make it more expensive for consumers. Sometimes natural gas actually is the way to go. Sometimes putting in an electric heat pump is actually not going to get you greater efficiency, because people may have backup gas or backup oil. And so we have to really think about, even with our efficiency technology, what is it that we're trying, the problem we're trying to solve for, and in what setup, in what community, what is the context in which we're trying to solve for that problem, and then what is the solution for that problem. I don't even know if I've answered your question at this point. I think I hopped on the soapbox and I'm trying to get off of it.
You have so far exceeded my question and my expectations with that beautiful answer. And I think you're going to get some help unexpectedly. I think one thing I've noticed over a number of decades that I've been practicing is some of the biggest energy policy changes come through crisis. Result of crisis. I see Phil nodding his head. It's probably not even an original thought on my part. Phil probably explained that to me 20 years ago. But, take a look at Fukushima, for example. In the aftermath of Fukushima, the Japanese society had to move toward greater energy efficiency and conservation. They made remarkable changes. They even had people wearing lighter clothing in the summer in the buildings as an acceptable measure, so that they could not turn the air conditioning on full blast. As we look at Europe, and I talk to my European region leaders in our law firm, the very first thing they're focusing on to get through the immediate winter is conservation. I mean, they are moving forward and doubling down on renewables, and they're doubling down on bringing in new liquefied natural gas facilities and so on. But right away, they're looking at a 15% reduction in usage on an emergency basis. My guess is that is going to create policy that will be useful, that we can learn from and will be useful for us out of pure necessity. And we have just a couple minutes left. Paula, are there any points that you really want to drive home in terms of, you've done such a good job, but the really prospects, is there anything that's really exciting you right now in terms of new technology regarding energy efficiency and conservation?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything about efficiency right now is really exciting, because it is, right, the basic kind of stuff of, caulking your windows and wrapping your water heaters. But so much of what's happening is really digital. So much of it is technology based. It's, right, appliances being able to talk to the grid, and the grid being able to talk to what's going on in your home, being able to shift load when you need to shift load, being able to pay consumers when you have to do that. So I think, right, what technology adds to efficiency is what makes it super exciting. What technology adds to efficiency also, right, has a separate set of challenges, but it also shows us how all of this stuff is connected in a very, very real way, and how we need to be paying more attention now to cyber, for example, right? Because as we're digitizing, we're also creating more opportunities for bad actors to get into our system. So we have to think about that. And if we're building virtual power plants and really engaging individual consumers or large businesses, you now know that there are other kinds of entry points that bad actors can have into your system that aren't actually even going through you, but going through someone else who's going through somebody else. So there are some other things that we also have to think about. And I think the administration and others are really very dialed in on this kind of stuff. So it's not that I feel any kind of worry about it. I think that they're very dialed in on it. But I think it's for us as an industry to just always remember that we are not a siloed industry anymore. I think we used to be able to work through our problems in a very siloed way without really thinking about the other industries that surround us. And I think that is what no longer exists. And efficiency is just one example of why it exists in that way, that we are no longer siloed. Because I'm not just talking about wrapping your water heater or turning the temperature down. I am talking about we can put a sensor on your meter. Your refrigerator can talk to this, can talk to that, and the utility company can talk to what's going on in your home. They can pull back your air when it's super hot and they think they're going to have a capacity problem. So we have the ability to do that through efficiency, but that means that, as an industry, we are no longer siloed. We absolutely need to care about what's going on with access to broadband. We absolutely need to care about what's going on with cybersecurity. We have to care about healthy homes. We have to care about the ability of people to age in place. If you create a healthy home for someone and then you do not have to move them out, they can age in place. That's a societal benefit that has a cost attached to it, or a reduced cost. And so efficiency is one of those things that I think also demonstrates that as an industry, we are no longer siloed. It's not just energy, it's energy plus, plus, plus. And to deal with these problems, we do need to think about it that way and create the kinds of partnerships and alignments that allow us to have much broader and diverse thinking around the issues that we're dealing with.
Really important point, Paula, and one that I haven't heard discussed in the way that you just have. I'm making a note of that because I really want to bring that into our discussion, that perspective on interconnectedness as opposed to siloed approach into our discussion on smart cities and connected communities. So making a note of that. We have a great question from Dr. Paul Sullivan, and probably each member of our panel could address pieces of this. But I love the comments that you've just made today, Paul, especially the last one. I'm taking my own notes. And so here is another question from Dr. Sullivan. The US rejects and wastes over 65% of the fuel it puts into the system. We can find the answers to energy security, resilience, and reliability in our wastefulness. Any ideas on how to get leadership in government and industry to put more thinking and effort into this?
I mean, one, and because I've never heard this statistic before, so one, thank you, Dr. Sullivan, for sharing it, because I think it's something we need to amplify. We just, and I just think broadly, and Rudy said this in his statement, we've got to move away from thinking we can build our way out of problems, right? We just are a society that we like to build stuff and we want to build our way out of stuff. And we don't really get thinking about what is it that I don't, and that, we can talk about that across the economy. That's just how we operate, I think, as broadly as a society. But being able to amplify those kinds of metrics, I was unaware, that kind of information. So if there's a way for them to put in the chat where that came from so that we can, in our messaging at the Alliance, talk about, right, wastefulness and why we shouldn't want waste. I think, where I would leave it is, if those of you who can remember where we started when New York and Chairman Zeitelman at the commission, and you can remember utility companies, I think it was Con Ed, wanting to build something, and the commission came back and said, no, find another way. Find another way to meet increasing demand. You don't get to build something. And they did. And I think that's part of what we have to challenge ourselves with, and we have to give policymakers the information they need to challenge us with it as well, which is, what is the other way beyond building something, beyond buying something? Is there another way to get there? And I think when you start to challenge people's thinking about wastefulness, in addition to, more diverse ideas, larger groups of, more diverse coalitions of people, you'll be shocked at the solutions that you get that will likely be cheaper, faster to implement, and more impactful, just because we were forced to think about doing it a different way that required us to not build something. You don't get to build a new thing. You got to figure out how you're going to serve with what you have already. And in the theme of resilience, we're resilient people. We do it all the time. We do it all the time at our own homes. I think our businesses can do it as well.
Truly so. Rudy, did I see your hand go up?
I was just going to offer up, we're trying to find a way to incent our counterparties on the gas supply side to be more proactive in their leak detection processes to address these type of issues. We've got council members that are interested in us, buying from, suppliers that don't flare, that fix their pipe when it's leaking. And there are ways it's not going to be regulated out of the value chain by the state of Texas regulators, who aren't necessarily interested in increasing regulation on the oil and gas industry. But you can incentivize gas suppliers to say, hey, we'll work with you on a program, and I'll just give you an example. If you can, reduce your leak loss, to no more than 10%, then maybe we'll pay you a premium on, our gas supply for environmental, responsibility, kind of ESG driven, structural, contractual provisions. We're actually looking at a way to do that. We want to partner with gas suppliers who are, paying attention to those type of sustainability practices so that, we can try to address, these emissions issues kind of one opportunity at a time. So again, you may not get it on the regulatory, construct side, but I do think you can get it. You can contract, provisions in there that address these issues so that at least you're making some progress.
Thank you, Rudy. Phil and Rich, did you have any parting comments that you would like to make?
Well, I'll just quickly add, I think that's a good frame that has been raised, and the more that can be documented, the more that will help in all the kinds of advocacy that goes on in the country. It's not brand new how wasteful we are, or how much more energy we use than, for example, other places around the world, kind of thing. But I do think it helps as a lens. I would just add in that part of the reason for documentation and advocacy is, to me, one of the aces in the whole of the American system is what we call civil society, in which all kinds of individuals can act on their own, independent of government. All kinds of groups can, and they can either influence the industry or they can influence the government policies. And the more they can see that there is this flab in the system, and therefore it isn't just a trade-off of, oh, I have to always pay more, or I have to do without, the better off. I think the more successful the advocacy on a lot of policies will be.
Thank you, Phil.
I just, quick reaction. First of all, enjoyed all the other comments and remarks by the other participants. Really appreciated it. And just to, echo one of the points I was making toward the end of my remarks is the importance of efficiency and demand response from a security point of view and a reliability point of view, in terms of like reducing your exposure. You do that through energy efficiency, and demand response as being a very important resilience feature to the system to enable the system to be more responsive when there's other disruptions going on in it. And so I think from an energy security point of view, I think you can also make a strong case for energy efficiency and demand response.
I totally agree. And, I think that we're going to discover going forward that, and I've seen a lot of analytics on this already. We talk about renewables and other supply side issues, which are vitally important, but where the real potential benefits are for climate change on a dollar impact basis and cost-effective basis, efficiency, conservation, those are going to have the opportunity for greater impact. And we just have to get them funded. We have to get people to hear Paula's message and the message you've each conveyed in your phenomenal presentations. One last comment for Dr. Sullivan also. I do a lot of work with the World Resources Institute. They did a very impressive study on food loss. The extraordinary percentage of food that is wasted in the supply chain, which also impacts energy. And to Paula's point of interconnectedness, it impacts many different subjects in a negative way. If we really took a holistic look at waste in fuel supply, water supply, food supply, there is it'll be shocking to all of us, but there's a tremendous opportunity to improve. Well, this might be my favorite panel and webinar of the year. I think you have done such a really good job, and I love it when I get to learn so much and hear things I haven't heard before. I'm sure the participants feel the same way. This will be recorded and we will spread this webinar far and wide. But on behalf of the audience, I'm going to give you an ovation. I'd make it a standing ovation, but I'm wearing shorts right now. But thank you for really just a great job. And have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks, Clint.